Well, this program, again, is going to be about the situation in Ukraine primarily, though I'm going to touch on certain other aspects of what is now clearly a global crisis, which is becoming in some ways more intense almost every day as the economic clouds continue to gather and darken. Anyway, firstly, let's deal with the situation on the ground. It's actually not particularly easy at the moment to get a full or clear sense of what is actually happening in Donbass. I say that because yesterday we had a whole succession of reports or comments by Ukrainian officials that the Russians have begun phase 2 of the operation to clear Donbass of Ukrainian troops. There's been no formal confirmation of this from the Russian Ministry of Defense, and certain comments by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, given over the course of a very long, 1 hour long interview to India Today television, I think were taken out of context and were treated as confirmation that the Russians have begun some kind of phase 2 offensive. Though I think if you listen to the interview in its entirety, it becomes clear that this is not quite the case. Anyway, nonetheless, those comments by the Ukrainian officials about phase 2 have highlighted events in Donbass. I should say that the Pentagon, not for the first time, appears to share some of my own skepticism about this. They've talked about limited offensives by Russian troops in Donbass, preparatory to what they still appear to believe is a big offensive, which is coming. I think all of this is a misunderstanding, and I think it's a misunderstanding of Russian tactics. I don't think the Russian way of war is to launch some great massive offensive all in one go, setting out to achieve a massive knockout blow once and forever and immediately. I've been, over the course of the last couple of days, reviewing the history of some of the previous battles that the Soviets fought during World War II, and I've also been looking at the kind of operations the Russians have fought in various parts of the world since the end of the Second World War, places like, well, Afghanistan, but also Chechnya, and of course in Syria. And also, perhaps usefully, the kind of advice and guidance the Soviets and the Russians appear to have been giving to other states that they were supporting over the course of their long wars against other countries, like, for example, Vietnam, Angola, to some extent Egypt. And the thing that comes across to me from looking at all of these accounts is that the Russian way of war is gradual, incremental, and overwhelming. In other words, the Russians actually tend to prefer grinding wars of attrition, which is consistent with their overall project, which I've discussed many times in many programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, which is to seek to grind down and destroy the enemy's army. They seek to put that army in a position of weakness, to encircle it, to place it in what they call a cauldron, and then they gradually and steadily eat away at the edges of the cauldron. They load it up with shells. They intercept supplies that are supposed to reach the troops encircled in the cauldron. And over days and weeks, eventually resistance becomes impossible, and you tend to see something like a collapse. So Russian approach is very much to wage this kind of attritional war. And I think that's exactly what the Russians are doing in Donbass. I think that's been their project, their approach all along, actually. They used the early offensives across Ukraine to pin down Ukrainian troops, defending places like Kharkiv, Kiev, Odessa, wherever, far from the main center of the battle, which was always in Donbass. And now that they've concentrated and are concentrating more and more of their forces in Donbass, they are now steadily and remorselessly increasing the pressure on those increasingly isolated Ukrainian troops. And I discussed some days ago what the Russians claim, what the Russians were claiming were the total casualties that the Ukrainians have suffered since the start of the operation. They put them at 23,000 in terms of irreplaceable losses, the great bulk of which will, of course, have been in Donbass. And, of course, that seems to correspond, that seems to be indirectly corroborated by reports in the US media, primarily in places like Bloomberg and CNN, that the Ukrainian military is running out of ammunition, running out of armored vehicles, struggling to keep supplies running to its frontline troops, and is apparently taking major losses. I'm going to come to that later in this program. So it seems to me that is probably more like what we're seeing. We're seeing a steady, incremental grinding down of Ukrainian forces in Donbass. And we're not going to see any giant offensives, vast tank armies moving and things of that kind, until, that is, that army in Donbass has been broken. And then, of course, at that point, as has happened in other wars, as happened, for example, in the 2014 war in Ukraine, where similarly the Ukrainian army was drawn into encirclements or cauldrons over a conflict that lasted from April until late July. And then after it was ground down in battles like the Battle of Ilovaisk, then it is at that point that we will see the rapid movements and the fast offensives to seize territory, resistance by this point from the organized forces of the Ukrainian military having been either broken down entirely or severely weakened. So I think this is probably more like what my understanding of Russian strategy is. I say that, I repeat again, I'm not a military person. I've never shown much interest in military affairs up to these last couple of weeks. Others, perhaps with more experience of military affairs, can comment and either refute or perhaps even to some extent support this analysis, but it is my own. So I think that these comments by the Ukrainian officials about the start of phase 2 is more about Ukraine trying to get Western governments to provide it with more weapons, more assistance at a time when Ukraine is running out of all of these things, than a real assessment of the true situation on the ground in Donbass. But that, of course, doesn't mean that there isn't actually very heavy fighting going on in Donbass, though my impression of that fighting is that it consists mainly of extremely heavy shelling by the Russian military, of now sustained bombing of Ukrainian positions by the Russian Air Force, and we're now starting to see increasing use by the Russians of their military aircraft, their Sukhoi 25 and Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers. And can I say there's been much discussion about why these weren't very visible earlier in the war? I think the short answer is that the Russians tend to use their air force in this kind of way, as a kind of aerial artillery to support troops on the ground in sort of ground support operations. They are less inclined to go in for long, deep operations over the skies of a contested state in the way that Western air forces tend to do. The Russians increasingly leave that sort of thing, long-range strikes deep behind the enemy's rear, to their standoff missile forces, which have shown over the course of this war their extraordinary potency and their ability now to strike at any place across Ukraine with devastating effect. I should say this just a few days ago, there was an extraordinary film published by some private individual in the city of Lviv in western Ukraine, which showed Russian cruise missiles striking some kind of large facility. The Ukrainians say it was a civilian facility. The Russians say it was a place where large amount of Western material, Western weapons were stored. And whatever the facts of that are, by the way, I indisputably in this occasion prefer the Russian assessment. Whatever the facts are, it was quite extraordinary to see these cruise missiles hitting this target with what looked like extraordinary precision, at least to my inexpert eyes. But anyway, to continue. So we have all of this going on in Donbass, and of course we are getting information of Russian ground force advances. And it seems that these are in the sort of northern districts of Donbass. The Russians and their allied forces from the Donbass militia seem to be concentrating heavily on clearing the two towns of Popasnaya and Rubizhnoye of Ukrainian troops, tightening their encirclement of the Ukrainian force dug in the Severodonetsk and Lysych conurbation, which is one of the cauldrons in which the Ukrainian forces in Donbass have been broken up into. And also perhaps, and more worryingly maybe, even than that for the Ukrainians, there seem to be more advances by the Russian military south of Izium as the Russian forces steadily move ever closer to Slavyansk, one of the two cities in the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, where the Ukrainians seem to be preparing some kind of stand, and also from a completely different direction against the town of Liman, or Krasny Liman, as the Russians still refer to it, which is an entirely new thrust from a completely different direction, but which also seems to be intended to gradually tighten the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in Donbass. So this looks like an incremental battle to me, probably one that will take several weeks to play out once Ukrainian forces in Donbass are broken. And there's some reports that the Russians expect to have something like 30,000 prisoners from these forces once the back of the resistance is broken. So that gives us some idea of the scale. Then maybe we will start to see the rather more dramatic offences that we sometimes that we sometimes hear about. By the way, there are examples of the same sort of thing in Western war. I remember once having the Normandy campaign in 1944 explained to me how the Allies ground down the German army in Normandy for around 2 months until eventually the German resistance in Normandy broke down, and then that was followed by very, very rapid advances over the course of August 1944, which brought the Allies to the gates of Paris and beyond. So, this is not entirely unusual war, and it seems to me the kind of war that we are probably seeing in Donbass. Anyway, so much for that. The other place where developments are taking place and where these developments take a very dramatic form is, of course, Mariupol. And for some time now, the fighting, as we know, has been concentrated in one place, which is the giant Azovstal steelworks. Now, the Russians have been repeatedly inviting surrenders of Ukrainian troops defending the steelworks, and every so often we hear reports that another dribble of Ukrainian troops, 10, 20, 30 of them at a time, have in fact surrendered to the Russians. And there was a report yesterday that the Russians and their allies, the Donbass militia and the Chechen forces, have in fact already captured or are in the process of capturing the northern part of this very large industrial facility. Well, whether that is the case or not, we did have earlier, a few hours ago, an extraordinarily plaintive video from a commander, a Ukrainian commander of the Ukrainian forces in Azovstal. And it is consistent with the incredibly contradictory accounts of the war that we're getting, that the Russians and the Western media each have referred to this video, and they've each identified the officer in question, but each of them ascribes him to a completely different unit. So in the Western media, he is a Marine, part of the regular Ukrainian armed forces, part of the Marine brigade that was defending Mariupol, many of whose soldiers gave up about a week ago. And the Russian media, by contrast, tend to ascribe him to the Azov battalion. They say that he's actually one of the leading commanders of the Azov forces. Well, I'm not in a position to say which is true, and I don't really think at this point it matters, actually, because what this man was saying is that the troops, the Ukrainian troops in the Azovstal factory, are absolutely at the end of their tether. They can only hold out for a few more days or perhaps even hours. He spoke about the fact that this might very well be the last message that Ukrainian troops would be able to broadcast from the Azovstal works. He spoke again about the presence of civilians on the Azovstal works, suggesting, by the way, that these are family members of some of the troops who are defending this factory. And he asked for outside powers to arrange the extraction of these troops from the Azovstal factory so that they could be taken to a third country. Not Russia, but not Ukraine either, interestingly. So it's some sort of proposal, as far as I can tell, for these troops to be interned in a third country, something that's not been happening up to now in this war. And it's a really rather strange idea if it's intended seriously. And perhaps the fact that it's been proposed by this officer, I have to say, it seems to me not just a strange idea, but if I understood it correctly, at this point in time, a far-fetched and unlikely one. What it would suggest to me is, again, the extent to which these troops defending themselves in the Azovstal steelworks are losing touch with the true situation in which they find themselves in. They still seem to think that there's some kind of hope of rescue, that they can avoid surrender to the Russians, that they can somehow reconcile the cause from Kiev that they go on fighting by accepting internment in some third country rather than accept the humiliation of being captured, formally captured by the Russians, which would of course contradict the orders that they're apparently still being given from Kiev. I mean, I have to say, I found it an extraordinarily sad video, somewhat filled with pathos, if you like, manipulative, many would say, and undoubtedly so to some extent, but also suggesting to me a lack of understanding of the overall realities. And that, by the way, reinforces a view that many have expressed, that the Ukrainian troops on the front lines are being provided with, shall we say, filtered information, not entirely surprising and not unusual in war, but that they don't always have a very clear understanding or comprehension of the overall situation in which the Ukrainian forces are in, and that certainly seems to be the case of these troops defending the Azovstal steelworks. By the way, there continues to be massive uncertainty as to how many of these troops there actually are. There's been suggestions that it's 1,500. The figure the Daily Telegraph gave a few days ago, 500, is certainly an underestimate. Others put it much higher, up to 4,000. I suspect 1,500 is about right. But what this commander did say is that there are hundreds of wounded, that they're not getting the proper treatment because the medical facilities have completely broken down, and one gets the sense of a desperate man in a desperate situation, heavily conflicted between impossible orders and a desperate situation which he cannot fully reconcile himself to. Meanwhile, the Russians have been opening up what they say humanitarian corridors from the Azovstal steelworks. This has come in for some criticism in Russia. People are saying there that them doing this, agreeing to brief ceasefires to allow these troops to lay down their arms and to allow civilians to leave, interrupts the tempo of operations, and it helps the Ukrainian troops there to presumably reorganize and continue resistance. I have to say, I'm not sure how that happens, given what this Ukrainian commander is telling us. But regardless, there is some criticism of this strategy in Russia. But putting all that aside, the situation does look extremely bleak for these fighters in the Azovstal works. And if they have any access to real information, I hope that eventually they will do what they are being urged to do by the Russians, which is to surrender and give up. And certainly, if there are indeed civilians in the Azovstal steelworks, something which is strongly disputed, by the way, by some people on the Russian side, I think that it is the duty of these commanders, of these people in the Azovstal steelworks, to ensure the safety of those civilians by negotiating a ceasefire with the Russians so that they can be evacuated from the steelworks and brought under Russian control. The Russians have repeatedly accused the Ukrainians of hiding behind human shields. If the Ukrainians misguidedly try to keep these civilians in the steelworks, assuming, of course, that they're even there, then, of course, I think there would be some weight to that Russian accusation. Anyway, that seems to be the situation in Mariupol. It really does look as if we are indeed, on the strength of the testimony of this particular officer, in the last stages of this battle. Probably it will all be over within a very short time. This officer, of course, spoke about hours or days at most, and who am I to say that he is wrong? Once the Azovstal steelworks is captured, the Russians will have a belt of territory, will control a belt of territory, a land bridge as it's put between the Donbass and Crimea, bringing in much of the territory of Zaporozhye region, most of it, in fact, not the major city of Zaporozhye, but most of the countryside, and the entirety of Kherson region. And that clearly has been a major Russian objective right from the start. I would also say that there does seem to be a significant Russian grouping in the western part of Kherson region, and there are reports of very heavy Russian missile and artillery strikes on Ukrainian forces in and around the port city of Nikolaev. And it could be that once phase 2 is completed, once the Russians have rolled up resistance, Ukrainian resistance in Donbass, then the next stage, phase 3, if you will, if the Ukrainians refuse to come to terms, is a Russian advance on Nikolaev, and who knows, beyond that, possibly to Odessa as well. I would say that the Russians simultaneously do what they always do. They continue to engage in negotiations with the other side. They've now sent a written statement of their demands, a further written statement of their demands to the Ukrainians. This is in purported response to the Ukrainian offer made in Istanbul, which the Russians complain the Ukrainians have now partly retracted. The Russians have now formally responded to that offer, presumably disregarding the Ukrainian retraction, and we will see what comes of it. But it's clear that for the moment, negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians are at a standstill. And to be straightforward about it, I doubt that with the present configuration of political forces in Kiev and in the West, there's any serious possibility of Ukraine, at least, coming to terms that are with the Russians on any basis that the Russians would deem acceptable, until certainly the fighting in Donbass is ended. And of course, if they still don't, then that offensive on Nikolaev and conceivably Odessa becomes a real possibility, in which case Ukraine risks being finally cut off from the sea. Anyway, that seems to me a fair overview of the military situation. As I said, the fog of war is heavy over Donbass. We have some more clarity about what's going on in Mariupol, but I think what I've just outlined is as reasonable an account of what's happening in eastern Ukraine as you will probably find. Anyway, in the meantime, there's been lots of news in other places. Firstly, the Western powers are clearly becoming increasingly alarmed by the situation, the military situation, and they seem to be stepping up their efforts to try to provide more military help in terms of weapon systems to Ukraine. And of course, we've had lots of javelins and stingers and all kinds of other Western weapons pouring into Ukraine. I'm beginning to come round, by the way, to the claims that many people have made. Jacob Dreisen, who writes the Dreisen Report, being one, others also, that some of these systems, some of these Western systems, their performance in this battlefield have proved disappointing, that they're overcomplicated, difficult to use, too heavy to lug around, and that large quantities of them are now falling into Russian hands. The last, by the way, is indisputably true. There are endless photographs and images churning out on the Runet of Russian and militia soldiers with large numbers of trophies of these Western weapons. If nothing else, the Russians are going to get a very good insight into how weapon systems like the Panzerfaust III, the Stinger, the Javelin, and who knows what other Western weapon systems, how all of these weapon systems work and what they can actually do. Interestingly enough, we've heard much less recently about these Switchblade drones, about which we were expecting to hear so much. It could be, just a guess now, that Russian jamming of GPS signals is taking a toll, because apparently these Switchblade drones to a great extent depend on GPS signals, and without them, they become even more difficult to use than they already are. Anyway, over and above these, if you like, lighter weapons, the Western powers have been now trying to beef up some of Ukraine's supplies of heavier weapons. And of course, we've had those 18 howitzers that the US has provided a short time ago with the 40,000 rounds of ammunition. We now hear from the United States that they're going to provide more ammunition and perhaps more howitzers. I have to say, all that's going to do, as far as I can see, is add to the count of destroyed howitzers and artillery pieces and ammunition that the Russians are already building up. With every single briefing that the Russians publish, one learns about more and more Ukrainian weapon systems, artillery pieces, tanks, armored vehicles, that sort of thing, that have been destroyed by the Russians over the course of this fighting. And by the way, film and pictures of Ukrainian troops maneuvering again seems to a great extent to corroborate this. It's rather disturbing to see Ukrainian troops on the front line now increasingly relying upon civilian vehicles, which by definition are unarmored, in order to move around, something which I would have thought would be incredibly dangerous in this kind of battlefield, and which of course does tend to again corroborate Russian claims that the larger part of Ukraine's armored vehicle fleet has been destroyed. And we are now also reading reports that with much of Ukraine's own industrial facilities destroyed by the Russians, the Ukrainians now have to turn to their friends in the Czech Republic to refurbish and repair some of the armored vehicles that have been damaged over the course of this fighting, which would mean, logically, that these armored vehicles will have to be moved from Ukraine all the way to the Czech Republic to be refurbished there, and then there has to be some way of moving them all back. And of course, the Russians will be able to keep track on all of this with their eyes in the sky and all those things. And it doesn't seem to me to be a particularly good logistical situation. So what all that points to my mind, is the fact that Ukraine is indeed running out of critical weapon systems. And of course, these additional supplies of more howitzers and more ammunition, as I discussed in my previous video, don't seem to be coming anywhere close to meeting Ukrainian needs. And both Bloomberg and CNN admitted that Ukraine is running through weapon systems faster than the Western powers can replace them. I would also add, by the way, that given that the Ukrainians historically have used Soviet calibers as against the calibers that NATO uses, supplying Western ammunition, Western shells and artillery to Ukraine is presumably going to complicate even further Ukraine's logistical position. And this mishmash of weapon systems from all sorts of different NATO countries, completely different weapon systems from different Western countries, I suspect is going to become an increasing problem for whoever is in charge of trying to replenish and keep these various different systems under repair. But then I'm not an expert in these things, so perhaps I shouldn't say too much about that. Anyway, turning to other things, we're now getting hints that the European Union is looking beyond the French elections to announce some kind of ban on imports of oil from Russia something which apparently, according to JP Morgan, will push our oil prices even higher than they already are, intensifying the problems, the inflation problems in the West. This, even as the Russians have apparently succeeded in finding other markets for their coal in India and China and elsewhere, and as they look increasingly likely to find other markets for much of their oil. But that, it seems, is what the Western powers are intending to do, or at least the Europeans are intending to do. But it comes following a rather interesting article in the Financial Times about one of the other places that the Europeans look to for replacements of Russian natural gas. Now, this is an article in the Financial Times, as it's behind a paywall. I'm not going to read it, but briefly, what this article says is that one of the countries that was looked to as the possible country that would replace Russian natural gas, Algeria, has signaled that it cannot do so. It simply cannot increase production by very much, and certainly by nothing like the levels that would be needed to make a real dent in the need for gas from Russia. So Algeria is proving a disappointment. This must be something of a disappointment for European leaders. The Italian Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, recently made a trip to Algeria, where he was apparently trying to get the Algerians to commit to supplying large volumes of natural gas to replace the natural gas that Italy receives from Russia. The Algerians have now come out and said clearly that they're just not in a position to do it to anything like the extent that would be needed. They can increase production to a certain degree, but it would only be a marginal increase, and it's not going to make the difference that many people thought it would, and at least that Mario Draghi perhaps hoped it would. And this, of course, comes after similar warnings from Qatar. And we are also getting reports that the release of oil from the US's strategic reserves, most of it, and this was intended to stabilize and lower oil prices, most of this oil that the US is now releasing from its reserves is actually heading to Europe. So it's looking as if the United States is trying to push the Europeans into announcing a ban on imports of Russian oil by providing the Europeans with oil out of its own strategic reserve. Now, that seems to me a rather reckless policy. It suggests, by the way, that the claimed reason, the purported reason for the release from the strategic reserve, which was to try to stabilize or reduce oil prices, is only partly true. What it means is that in pursuit of this increasingly reckless sanctions war or economic war of attrition against the Russians, the United States, or to be more precise, the Biden administration, seems to be prepared to run down to dangerously low levels the US's own strategic oil reserve. I have to say that this seems to me incredibly unwise. It has the impression of the United States acting in an increasingly frenetic way, or at least the administration acting in an increasingly frenetic way, in the hope that if it does this, something will happen, something in Russia will snap before that strategic oil reserve finally exhausts itself at some time in the autumn. Well, That may be something, that dramatic thing will happen. But I have to say, it doesn't seem at all likely to me. Anyway, that's the situation on the energy front. But there is, of course, a further very interesting article in the Financial Times which points to the situation on the financial front. And here we've had the Western sanctions, the disconnection of Russian banks from SWIFT, the pull out from Russia of Visa and MasterCard. Had any of that happened in 2014 or 2014 or 2015 or earlier years, that would have been devastating. The Financial Times now accepts that the arrangements that the Russians made, their success in building up their own alternatives to SWIFT, their success in developing their own domestic payment systems around the Mir card, all of that has meant that the Russian financial system has continued to function unimpeded. Russians are barely affected by these kind of sanctions. They can even continue to use their own Visa and MasterCards if they are released to them by Russian banks, because all the processing of transactions on those cards takes place now within Russia itself. So the financial sanctions, which once upon a time, not so long ago, were seen as the magic bullet, it turns out are not any kind of bullet at all. In the run-up to the war, when the sanctions were being discussed, I was repeatedly reading in all sorts of places that disconnecting Russian banks from SWIFT was the nuclear option, that it was going to be the event that was going to knock out the Russian economy. And now we have an article from the Financial Times, which in effect admits that that nuclear option, as it was supposed to be, has turned out to be a blank. Well, I'm not going to make any future predictions about where this economic war of attrition is going. Clearly, Russia's in for a tough patch. Inflation has risen. There's been a fall in production. There's severe logistical difficulties. The Russians seem confident that they can pull it round, and I suspect that they're right. What seems to me indisputable, however, is that the inflation crisis across the West is now deepening. And apparently in Germany now, the trade unions have joined German industry in calling for a stop to any idea of sanctions on Russian gas imports. The unions and industry are saying that this would be devastating for the German industrial economy. Well, we will see whether these wise counsels prevail in the atmosphere of hysteria that we are seeing. But it's increasingly looking to me as if the Western powers, astonished, dismayed that their financial shock and awe, what Putin called sanctions blitzkrieg of February and early March, have not delivered the knockout blow on the Russian economy that they expected. That they're now throwing everything they possibly can at the Russian economy in the hope that they can capsize it, and that they now have a limited time window, perhaps running up to autumn, before they start to find themselves in a very difficult situation indeed, if they haven't by that point achieved the objective that they are looking for. I think this is reckless. I think this is extremely dangerous. I think that it looks to me like a gamble, and given the stakes, a gamble which is being played with the economies and livelihoods of tens of millions of people in the West. Even the Financial Times is now admitting that there's now real risks of massive food shortages and starvation across the global south, I would have thought that the time has now come for councils of prudence to take over, for people in the West to come to understand that this economic war of attrition is not going as planned. That time has come to call a stop. Time has come to negotiate some kind of settlement of this crisis in Ukraine, something which ought to have been achieved before the war even started, and that to do otherwise is to take massive and dangerous and reckless risks which could turn out very, very badly if things turn out wrong. In the meantime, it seems to me that the war in Ukraine continues. I don't get any sense that the Russians have weakened in their resolve. The long interview that Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, gave to India today seemed to suggest a confident Russian leadership which feels that things are going very much its way. Perhaps one ought to take note of that if one is in the West and start adjusting to the realities of it. I would add that I'm also starting to get the sense of a festering political crisis in the United States. It does seem to me as if more and more Democrats are now becoming increasingly worried that the party is going to experience very heavy losses in the November midterms. There was what looked to me to be an almost panicked statement from Senator Elizabeth Warren, which made certain implied criticisms of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And we also see these legal investigations, one into Russiagate by Special Counsel Durham, the other one into what you might call Laptop Gate by various other people. They're continuing to rumble away in the distance, with each, it seems to me, having the potential to cause a very serious political crisis in the United States if they burst into life. Now, Robert Barnes, who we did, the great US attorney, who we did a wonderful program with yesterday on the Duran, he said that Laptop Gate looked to him to be a way to keep President Biden himself in line, to make sure that he doesn't waver in his commitment to Ukraine. And, Robert Barnes has an understanding of American politics, which is far more profound than mine, and I'm sure he's right. The one thing I would say about this is that it's always a dangerous game, it seems to me, to play this sort of thing. Because, of course, there's always the risk that it can run out of control. If there is a landslide, a Republican landslide in November, and a whole lot of new, angry and strong-minded Republicans are elected to Congress, particularly in the House, I can very easily see how they could run with Laptop Gate. Apparently, the congressional Republicans already have the laptop or a copy of it, and they could start investigations of their own and quickly take this whole thing out of the control of the Justice Department, assuming the Justice Department continues to serve the administration as it has been doing at the moment. So it seems to me growing economic problems, a gathering inflation crisis, a festering political crisis in the United States. I would have thought, looking at all of this, this is the moment when wiser counsels, as I said, should prevail. And instead of doubling down with more sanctions, more weapon systems, more ammunition, more shells, more howitzers, more aircraft. We don't quite know what sorts of aircraft, but anyway, apparently aircraft of some kind have been provided, none of which are making any particular difference to the direction of the battle. The time has come for someone, somewhere, to say enough and to start to look for a way out. Well, thank you for joining me again for this program today. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Remember, you can find us on other platforms and, of course, Rumble and Locals that I mentioned at the start of this program are the two main ones, but you can also find us on multiple others as well. Also, you can support us if you wish via Patreon and Subscribestar. You'll find links under this video. And of course, don't forget to check out our shop. You'll find lots of great things there. Magic mugs, t-shirts, hoodies, hats, all sorts of great things. Last but not least, you can support us via by checking your subscription to this channel, and if you've liked this video, by ticking the like button. That's enough from me today. Thank you for staying with me. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a very good day until then.